The voicemail from the gallery director was already there when I woke up. Short, professional. She said my exhibition slot had been reassigned and that the decision had come directly from the coordinator I'd authorized. She used a name I didn't recognize. I didn't call back right away. I dressed, packed my bag, and left the apartment as usual. The elevator smelled faintly of paint thinner. When I reached the street, my car wasn't where I'd parked it the night before. There was no ticket, no broken glass, just an empty space and a street cleaner moving past it. I took a rideshare to my studio instead. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the lights were on and the work tables had been cleared. Not emptied, curated. Half-finished pieces stacked carefully along the wall, labeled in neat handwriting that wasn't mine. A clipboard lay in the center of the main table with a schedule clipped to it. My name was printed at the top. Beneath it, tasks assigned to other people. I stood there long enough for the reality of it to settle into place without explanation. Then I locked the door and left. I'd met Daniel 6 weeks earlier when the freight elevator jammed during a delivery, and he was already there. He was already inside the shaft when I arrived, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, tools spread out beside him like he'd planned to be there. He didn't look up right away. He finished tightening something, tested it, then stood and asked what floor I needed. He wasn't assigned to my building. He said he'd been subcontracted last minute. Temporary coverage. He got the elevator moving again and refused payment, said it wasn't his call to charge. Before leaving, he wrote his number on a scrap of cardboard and told me to text if it stuck again. It did stick again. He came back after hours, brought his own light, stayed until it worked. I offered him coffee. He declined, but sat with me while I waited for the last crate to come down. We talked about space, about how hard it was to work when everything felt provisional. He listened carefully like he was aligning pieces. After that, he started appearing at moments that didn't ask to be explained. When a delivery was late, he was already there. When I needed extra hands to move something heavy, he didn't ask questions. He didn't linger either. He did the work and stepped back, waiting for the next instruction. I gave him a key because it was easier than coordinating schedules. He never used it when I was there. He'd text before coming in after leaving. Sometimes I'd find notes about small adjustments he'd made to the space. Better flow, safer placement. He framed it as suggestions, but the results were obvious. The first night he stayed over wasn't planned. We'd been working late, and he fell asleep sitting upright on a crate. I covered him with my jacket. Later, he moved to the couch without waking me. In the morning, the studio was cleaner than I'd ever seen it. He'd made a list of things that needed attention and left it by my tools. I started to rely on that list without thinking about why. He never asked for credit. When people assumed he was my assistant, he corrected them. When they assumed he was in charge, he didn't. He just kept things moving. He handled conversations I didn't want to have. Smoothed conflicts. Redirected attention back to the work. By the time the gallery emails started going through him instead of me, it felt efficient. By the time I realized I wasn't copied anymore, it felt temporary. Standing in the empty studio that morning, I understood only one thing clearly. Whatever had shifted hadn't happened all at once. It had already been finished. Daniel began showing up earlier than I did. Not every day, just often enough that it stopped feeling unusual. I'd unlock the studio and find the lights already on, the air warmer than it should have been, the coffee machine running with a fresh filter in place. He never acted like he'd been waiting. He was always in the middle of something small and necessary. He didn't take over my work. He adjusted the conditions around it. Cleared paths, reset tools, labeled shelves that had never needed labels before, but suddenly made sense once they existed. When I asked him to stop reorganizing one section, he did immediately and didn't revisit it. That mattered to me. It made everything else easier to accept. We didn't talk about being together. We spent long hours in the same room, moving around each other without friction. Sometimes he touched my arm to guide me past a corner. Sometimes he stood close enough that I could feel his heat without him leaning in. When I worked late, he stayed. When I didn't, he left. One night, a piece cracked while cooling. It wasn't catastrophic, but it ruined the line of the set I was building. I didn't react. I set it aside and kept working. Daniel watched without interrupting. Later, I found the broken piece repaired, the seam almost invisible. He'd used a technique I hadn't learned. He didn't explain it. He just placed it back where it belonged. I let him. Not through reassurance. Through correction that didn't ask permission and didn't demand gratitude. He noticed what I missed when I was tired. He caught errors before they became problems. When I asked him why he bothered, he shrugged and said it was easier if things worked. The first time he touched me deliberately was also practical. I'd strained my wrist lifting something alone. He wrapped it without comment, fingers precise, pressure firm. He didn't ask if it hurt. He adjusted until it didn't. After that, he kept an eye on it, shifting tasks without making a point of it. I didn't tell him to stop. We started sleeping at the studio on nights when deadlines pressed. On a narrow cot behind the storage wall, bodies aligned for space rather than intimacy. He slept lightly, waking when I moved. In the morning, he was always up first, resetting the room to neutral. No signs of use. No reminders of closeness unless I looked for them. People began to assume he was part of the operation. Not an assistant. Not a partner. Something undefined but necessary. When suppliers asked questions, he answered calmly, deferring to me only when it mattered. I didn't correct them. It saved time. At some point, he suggested creating a shared schedule so nothing overlapped or stalled. He showed me how he tracked tasks, color-coded, efficient. I gave him access to mine so he could sync it. He didn't add himself to personal events. Only work. The gallery coordinator emailed him directly asking for updates. He forwarded the message to me with a short note. Just looping you in. I replied all without thinking. After that, replies stopped including me. There were moments I registered without stopping for. A meeting moved without my approval. A crate shipped early. Payment handled before I saw it. Each time the outcome was good. Better than before. One evening, I came in to find a new lock installed on the supply room. Daniel handed me a key and said some things had gone missing lately. I hadn't noticed anything missing. I took the key anyway. I didn't ask what else he'd secured. It was easier to work when I didn't have to watch everything. Felt like support. Like something holding me in place while I leaned forward. I didn't realize how much of my weight I'd already shifted onto him. The decision came on a day that didn't feel important. I was rushing between tasks, phone pressed to my shoulder, answering questions that stacked faster than I could clear them. Daniel waited until I finished the call. He didn't interrupt. He handed me a printed sheet, already folded once, and said it would make the next month easier. It was a temporary authorization. That was how he framed it. So he could approve materials and scheduling changes without pulling me out of work. So nothing stalled while I was installing or traveling between sites. He pointed to the line I needed to sign. He'd already filled in the rest. I skimmed it. The language looked familiar. Clean. Boring. The kind of thing I'd signed 100 times before for assistants, fabricators, coordinators. This one just covered more ground. Broader access. Still temporary. I signed standing up, pen balanced against a crate, thinking about the piece cooling in the kiln. After that, things moved faster. Too fast to feel wrong. Daniel stopped asking questions altogether. He informed me of outcomes. This shipment rescheduled. That meeting handled. A conflict resolved before it reached me. I stayed focused on the work itself, the part that mattered. I told myself this was what support looked like when it was done well. The studio changed shape without changing appearance. Tools migrated slightly. Storage shifted. The locked supply room stayed locked. I kept the key on my ring but rarely used it. Anything I needed appeared when I asked for it. We were closer physically during that period. Not more emotional. Just more present in each other's space. He stood behind me when I worked at the bench, hands near but not touching, steadying the table when it vibrated. At night, we slept without talking, bodies aligned out of habit rather than intention. In the morning, he left before I woke. I didn't notice when his name started appearing first on correspondence. Only that replies came back quicker. Only that problems stopped finding me. One afternoon, I arrived to find the studio occupied by people I hadn't invited. Installers. Two assistants I didn't recognize. They were polite, efficient. They said Daniel had scheduled them to help prep for the exhibition. I told them there must be a mistake. They checked their notes. They said everything was approved. I called Daniel. He didn't answer. I let it go to voicemail and walked the space with them instead, answering questions, making adjustments. Felt easier than stopping everything. Later, when Daniel finally called back, he sounded tired. He said the gallery had moved up the timeline and he'd adjusted accordingly. He said he didn't want to distract me while I was working. He said I'd thank him later. I didn't argue. That night, I tried to access the gallery portal from home. My login didn't work. I reset the password. The reset email never came. I assumed it was a glitch and went to bed. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a notification from the gallery's social feed. A preview announcement. My name was there. The work was there. The contact listed wasn't me. It was Daniel. I told myself it was a clerical error, that it would be fixed with one call. I went to the studio to straighten it out. The door code didn't work. I stood there longer than I should have, entering it again, slower this time. Still nothing. I tried my key. The lock turned, but the door didn't open. From inside, I could hear voices. Movement. Work continuing. I knocked. Someone opened the door halfway and smiled, apologetic. They said Daniel wasn't in yet, but everything was under control. They said I could wait outside if I wanted. I stepped back without answering. I understood then that the authorization I'd signed hadn't just covered tasks. It had changed where decisions lived. It had replaced me, and I'd done it myself. I didn't go back to the studio that day. I walked instead, farther than I usually did, past streets I didn't recognize as part of my routine. I needed distance more than answers. By the time I stopped, my phone showed 3 missed calls from numbers I knew and 1 message from Daniel. Everything's fine. There was confusion at the door. I'll sort it out. I didn't reply. The next morning, an email arrived from the gallery. Polite, apologetic. They thanked me for my flexibility and said they were excited about the revised installation plan. The email was addressed to Daniel with me copied below. That was new. I replied directly, short and clear, asking for a call. The response came from an assistant I'd never met. She said Daniel was coordinating all communications to keep things streamlined. She suggested I forward any questions through him. That afternoon, I tried another angle. I contacted a supplier I'd worked with for years, someone who'd known me before the studio, before the gallery, before any of this. I asked about a delayed order. They hesitated. Then they said they couldn't discuss it with me anymore. They said Daniel had asked that everything go through him to avoid mixed signals. They assumed that was fine. I said it wasn't. They apologized and said they didn't want to get in the middle. By the end of the day, it was clear that stopping one thread didn't slow the weave. The structure held without me. Daniel finally came to see me that night. Not at the studio. At my apartment. He knocked once the way he always had and waited. He didn't come inside right away. He stood in the doorway, hands loose at his sides, looking at the space like he was taking inventory. He said I looked tired. He said we should talk calmly. I asked him when he'd changed the door code. He said it was a safety update. Temporary. I asked why my access had been limited. He said it hadn't been. It had been redirected. He spoke carefully, as if choosing words that couldn't be misquoted later. He said the exhibition was too important to risk delays. He said the gallery needed one point of contact. He said I'd agreed to that when I signed the authorization. I told him that wasn't what I'd meant. He nodded. He said intention and effect weren't always the same. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse me of anything. He talked about continuity, about momentum, about how fragile these opportunities were. He said he'd taken on pressure so I wouldn't have to. I asked him if I could come back to the studio. He said of course. Just not right now. Too many people. Too many moving parts. He didn't want me distracted. He said it like a kindness. When he left, he took nothing with him. He didn't need to. His presence remained in the apartment in small, corrected ways. The thermostat adjusted. A stack of mail sorted. A note on the counter reminding me to eat. Over the next days, the messages shifted in tone. Less reassurance. More updates. Statements instead of explanations. He told me when things were done, not what they were. I stopped being copied altogether. I tried to show up at the studio again. The door opened this time. A woman I didn't know smiled and asked if she could help me. She said Daniel was running late, but everything was on track. She gestured inside, not inviting, not blocking, just indicating motion. Inside, my work was nearly finished. It looked good, better than I'd imagined. I felt an odd relief seeing it there, intact, elevated, already belonging to something larger than me. That relief scared me more than being locked out, because it meant he hadn't destroyed what I cared about. He'd absorbed it. By the time I left, I realized I hadn't corrected anyone when they referred to the studio as his operation. I didn't even notice it happening. After that, Daniel stopped coming to my apartment. He didn't need to. Everything he wanted to say arrived in my inbox, formatted, neutral, complete. Updates about timelines. Confirmations of deliveries. Notes about press interest. He used my name in the third person the way people do when they're already speaking to someone else. I tried to insert myself back into the flow in small ways. I replied to an email he was copied on. No one answered. I showed up to a planning meeting listed on the shared calendar. They thanked me for stopping by and said Daniel would brief me later. Later never came. The exhibition opened without me there. I watched it unfold through photos posted by other people. Wide shots of the space. Close-ups of my work under clean lighting. Daniel stood at the edge of several frames. Never centered, always available. People leaned toward him when they spoke. I recognized the posture. I'd leaned that way too. The gallery sent a formal thank you the next morning. They praised the coordination, the execution. They mentioned how smooth everything had been given the compressed timeline. They thanked Daniel by name. My name appeared once. In a caption. When I tried to address it directly, Daniel answered for the first time in days. He suggested we not mix emotions into something that was already working. He said visibility came in cycles. He said the work mattered more than credit. He said this was the part where I could rest. I asked him when my access would be restored. He didn't answer that question. He sent a document instead. It outlined a temporary restructuring, clear roles, clear authority, a plan for reintroduction. Once the exhibition closed and things settled, there was a place for my signature. I didn't sign it. That was when the practical consequences surfaced. My studio rent was paid early, but from an account I didn't recognize. The insurance policy listed Daniel as primary contact. A shipment of new materials arrived and was signed for by someone else, then stored somewhere I couldn't access. When I asked where, the reply came back: secured offsite. I felt myself shrinking inside the margins of my own operation. Friends asked how the show was going. I said it was successful. That was true. They asked why I wasn't posting about it. I said I was busy. That was easier than explaining why I felt like a guest in my own work. One afternoon, I went to the studio unannounced. The door opened. No resistance this time. Inside, the space felt finished. Not active. Cleaned of process. My tools were gone. The surfaces bare except for the work itself. Daniel wasn't there. A young assistant approached me, careful. She asked if I was there for pickup. She had a checklist in her hand with my name on it. I asked what she meant. She said Daniel had arranged for my remaining personal items to be boxed and transferred. He'd said I might want them sooner rather than later. He'd given instructions to accommodate me. She gestured toward the back. There were boxes stacked neatly, labeled. My handwriting on none of them. I opened one. Sketchbooks. Old notes. Things I hadn't touched in years but still recognized as mine. Evidence of process. History. Not tools. not access. I asked where the rest was. She checked the list. She said that was everything allocated to me. I stood there longer than necessary, the way people do when they're deciding whether to argue or accept a version of reality that's already been finalized. I carried 2 boxes out myself. No one offered to help. Outside, the street looked the same as it always had. Cars passing, people moving on. Nothing marked the fact that I'd just been reduced to a subset. That evening, Daniel sent one last update before the silence deepened. Everything is stable now. You don't need to worry anymore. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down and didn't turn it back over. For the first time since he'd entered my life, nothing required my response. And somehow that was the most unsettling part. I went back to the studio once more early before anyone else arrived. The door opened without resistance. Inside, the space was silent in a way it never had been before. No hum of equipment. No smell of heat or dust. The work stood finished, arranged for viewing, stripped of the mess that proved it had been made. My boxes were gone. In their place was a single envelope on the main table. My name printed cleanly on the front. Inside was a key card and a short note. Personal access. Storage only. Please collect remaining items this week. There was an address at the bottom. Not the studio. Not my apartment. Somewhere industrial, far enough away to feel intentional. I didn't go that day. Instead, I watched the exhibition unfold without me. Articles appeared. Reviews. Quotes attributed to the team. Daniel's name surfaced often. Always described as the quiet force behind the success. I was mentioned as the artist, past tense implied without being stated. When people reached out, they did it carefully, congratulating me while asking indirectly if everything was okay. I said yes. I said it had been intense. I said I was taking a break. Those statements were true enough to pass. I finally went to the storage address 3 days later. The building was concrete and glass, recently renovated. A man at the desk checked my name and handed me a clipboard. He said the unit had already been cleared for access. Inside were shelves. On them, my life reduced to what could be removed without disrupting anything else. Sketchbooks, old reference materials, personal effects from the studio that had no operational value. Everything labeled, inventory, preserved. At the center was a crate marked Archive Originals. I opened it. Inside were molds, early prototypes, iterations that showed my hand before refinement. Not damaged. Not stolen. Preserved like artifacts. Useful but no longer active. I understood then that nothing had been destroyed. Daniel hadn't taken my work from me. He had completed it without me. I closed the crate and locked the unit. At the desk, I returned the key card. The man nodded and checked something off without comment. When I got back to my apartment, there was a message waiting. The last one. The exhibition has closed successfully. All obligations are fulfilled. You won't be needed moving forward. No signature. I didn't reply. That night, I packed what I could carry. Clothes. Documents. The things that still answered to me. I left the rest. There was no point pretending the space belonged to me anymore. I checked into a small hotel nearby. Paid for 4 nights. Didn't ask for a receipt. On the second morning, I tried to log into the shared calendar out of habit. My access was gone. No error. Just absence. As if I'd never been part of it. I closed the app. From the window, I watched people enter buildings they still had permission to be in. Swipe. Open. Belonging confirmed. I thought about the first time Daniel fixed the elevator. How he'd waited until it worked before standing up. How competent that had felt. How safe. I thought about how easily I'd stepped aside once things ran smoothly. Only a completed process that no longer required me. When I left the hotel on the 4th day, I didn't know where I was going yet. Just that I wouldn't be returning to the studio, or the version of myself that had assumed proximity meant participation. What he'd taken wasn't my work. It was the space where my decisions used to matter. And it was already gone by the time I noticed.